are watching Darasa Online.
Dear students, welcome to today's sessions, which is just the continuation of the last sessions which we had. Today we are going to revise the so-called Geography Paper 2, which is all about human and economic geography. That particular paper, basically it is composed with the two topics. The first topic is all about population development, and the second topic is all about regional focus studies. But today is because we just continue from where we ended last time. It's all about population development, and we are targeting to the fourth subtopic, which is all about population growth and social and economic planning. So for that particular subtopic, which we're supposed to revise, we'll be having some issues that we're supposed to achieve at the end of these lessons. And according to the objectives that has been targeted for today's revision, we have the first one, which is all about conceptualizations. We'll be conceptualizing three concepts, that is population, development, and environment. And then we will go to the second objectives, which is all about drawing the case of Africans as an area where we find that there are so many population problems, despite that the land is too vast, but still there are so many problems facing that particular continent. Again, at the end of the sessions, or the revision for today's, we'll be trying our best to come up with the solutions on how can we address those problems facing the populations of Africa. And then we'll end up with a sample of questions, especially for the essay type of questions, which is related with how do we approach those questions which are related with essay type specific in population and development. Okay, dear students, before we start our session, I think it's much better if at all we can have an overview or recording about the guiding questions that will be guiding our revision. And those questions, they're about three. They will guide our revision. The first question is about examining the effects of high population growth on the environment. So we have to examine the effects of high population on the environment. But again, question number two, it's all about accounting for the 6 measures in place to control the urban populations. Then you should cite your examples from Tanzania and cities. So we have the cities in Tanzania, and that particular question is asking us to account for the measures in place that are going on that are intending to control the population specific in the urban areas. And the urban areas, I think, we're talking about Darasa, you're talking about Dodoma, you're talking about Arusha, you're talking about Mbeya, plus Mwanza. Those are the urban areas. So we just want to cross-check over there what's happening, especially along the urban areas. Question number 3, it's all about 6 measures to be taken by Tanzanian government to manage urban populations. So you should suggest the 6 measures to be taken by the government so as to manage the urban population, because we have seen that there are so many problems over there. So those will be the questions that will guide our revision for today. So let's stick on them, let's internalize them, and let's move with them. So whatever we're discussing over there, you should be making a recall, or you recall about those questions. And then we wind up our sessions. So let's start our session afresh. So without wasting time, let's go direct to the conceptualizations. On the part of the conceptualizations, as we said, just a matter of revision. You remember we have the population, and the population over there, we are talking about the human populations. On the aspect of human populations, I think it's all about we just refer to the total number of people who are living in a certain geographical area at a specified period of time. But we can talk the population starting from the local area to the global level. That's the first concept connected with the so-called human populations. But we have the second concept, which is all about the environment. Environments simply just refer to the total surroundings. We can talk in the form of air, water, but the other concept, which is very important, it's all about the development. Development is just, according to our concern, which is based on human and economic geography. We're not talking about development on the other side, though it's just the same concept. It's about a process that creates growth, progress, positive change, and addition of physical, economic, environmental, social, and demographic components. But again, the purpose of development is to reach the highest level so that we can improve the living standard of the people. But the development can be something which is visible, not necessarily immediate, and include all aspects of quality of change and the creations of the conditions for the continuation of that particular change. But on the other side, we can talk about economic development. On the economic development, we just refer to the increase in the per capita income and the standard of living of a nation or the populations with sustained growth from the simple low-income economy to modern high economy up to the highest level. It is a process which involves qualitative and quantitative change of the economy, leading to the increased real per capita income, better standard of living, and economic transformations over the long period of time. So I think up to that particular point, you have ABCD connected with all three concepts. So we just go to the second aspect, because we are still talking about those issues. I just want to give you some facts related with what we are supposed to attain at the end of the sessions. And those facts, it's all about African continent. The current population of African is about 1.3 billion. But again, African population is equivalent to 16.72% of the total world populations, but also it ranks number 2 among the region of the world. The population density of African is 45 per square kilometer. The total area is about 29.6 kilometers squared. But again, around 43.8 of the population is living in the urban area. The median age for African is about 19.7 years when you compare with other developed countries like USA, Japan, which is all about 38.3 years. That's what we're talking about, the African continent. You can just have an overview and get the concept connected with the African continent. But again, we can also relate with the other countries because we're talking about the populations. You can just recall about the smallest country in the world because we have the so-called Monaco plus the Vatican. Take an example of Monaco, which is one of the European city-states. It has a population density of 150 people per square kilometer. While we have said for Africans, it's all about 45 people per square kilometer. So if you make a comparison over there, you find that African, despite of being huge or having the vast area, still it is facing so many problems related with the populations. But also, we can also cite another example connected with Monaco, which is having 2.02 kilometers squared, while for Africans, we have said it's all about 29.6 kilometers squared. So if you compare the two countries, you'll find that Monaco seems to be small, but Africans seem to be vast. But still, we are facing so many problems, something which is the vice versa of what we expected, or we could expect. I think we can just recall about Monaco, one of the city-states in Europe, especially in the Western Europe. But you can check the way they have developed it. They have created their developments, or will come up with an aspect of the so-called problems facing African populations, one of which is about the issue of settlements. But you can check over there, within 2.02 kilometers squared, how have they managed that particular end? And they are living well when you compare with Africa. So, having seen those concepts, having introduced some facts connected with African, I think it's now the time, if we could go and cross-check, if we go and recall the interrelationship among those three variables which we have said, and that is about development, then we have population, and we have environment. So I will try to use that triangle so that we can establish the interrelationship among those three variables. Then we go for the discussions of all about Africans. How is it facing so many problems related with the populations? I think we know that the population is the one which is pushing the development. But again, that particular development is taking place on the environment. But again, the populations is influencing or doing various activities which is pressed on the so-called what? The environment, which in the form of land, water, air. So those three concepts over there, they are much related. As we have said that Africa is a vast continent with a very small population density. I think, remember, we said it's about 45 people per square kilometers. Yet it is suffering more from population problems. So we are much interested or to revise some problems facing the African continent so that you can be able to establish a relationship with your friends. Then the following are the common problems facing the development of African countries or the populated countries, and most of them, they are developing countries. You can just take one of the problems which is facing developing countries about the population explosion on the land, which later on will result into the problems like fragmentation of the land or land degradations. This is due to the deforestation, the severe soil erosions. This can be observed in some parts of Kilimanjaro, Kagera regions. But related with the population growth along those areas, mainly that will be due to the natural population dynamics, which is specifically all about birth. But number two, as the problems facing the African populations, it's about there is a high rate of unemployment. This is common both in rural and urban areas. The persistence of these problems results into high level of poverty due to the high rate of dependence, thus lowering the standard of living. And this can be observed in Tanzania due to the low level of industrializations, few jobs that has been created, which for the time cannot be satisfying the people. But again, we have there are so many measures in place trying to address the problems. The third population problems facing African countries is all about the presence and the practices of poor farming methods. If you trace the most populated area in Africa, they are dominated with the poor farming methods, which results into the high rate of environmental destructions and low yield, which cannot satisfy the demand of the populations. That's why we come up with the food shortage. You can just recall on the last years what happened in the northern region of Kenya, that's Kamajong. But again, this also happened along the central parts of Tanzania. That is, if you assess Tabora, Dodoma, plus the southern region, that is Lindi, sometimes they do face the so-called the famine, which is also caused by the poor farming methods. But the fourth one, it's the presence of high rate of rural-urban migrations. This is mainly caused by the stagnation of the agricultural sectors, especially in the rural areas. Thus, massive affluence of the people toward the urban areas. They are searching for the jobs, and this is highly due to the young generations, or it is targeted to the young generations who have seen young people moving from Songwe, Morogoro, and Singida. They are flowing to Dar es Salaam for the housework-related activities. But those are just a few examples. We have so many regions where we see there is high flow of people coming to the urban areas. The fifth one, which is another problem, it's about limited, but sometimes it's about the lack of social services, like education, health, clean water, and decent housing facilities, despite of the government's efforts of spending a lot of money providing those facilities, but the situation is still the same. This is due to the persistence of high birth rate, which is the key issues within the population policy. A good example can be cited from some parts of Burundi. Take an example of Kenya, take an example of Rwanda. But for the case of Rwanda, have paid a visit over there. They have a live example. We can call one of the tribal, which is the Twa tribal. Those people, they are really facing poverty to the highest level. Why? It's all about the issue of birth, and due to the lack of social services. As I've said, it's about health, education, even transport sectors. The sixth one, we can talk about the high growth rate, especially of the slums. This is mainly caused by uncontrolled migration of the people in the urban areas. The life in the slum is dominated by the poor living standards, being indicated by the poor housing and poor and hygienic conditions. This creates the challenge to the government on how to provide the basic services like water, education, transport, infrastructures. This is common in some parts of urban areas. For instance, in Dar es Salaam, we have a specific area like Vingunguti, Manzese, and Jangwan. But also, we can talk about Kampala in Uganda. They have specific slums. If you go to Kenya, you find there is Juakali. But again, in South Africa, we have so many slums in Johannesburg. But the other one is about the high birth rate, which later on will determine the population growth. For instance, in Tanzania, the population growth rate is about 2.6. If you go to Kenya, the population growth rate is about 3.7. That's according to 2017 data. But again, you have Mozambique, which have the high fertility rate. When you go to Kenya, it's about 3.5. Ethiopia, it's about 4.3. When you compare with developed countries like Italy, you find that they have 1.3. So you find that those developed countries, they have low birth rate, but when you come to the developing country, you find there is a high birth rate. So if you make the comparison over there, you come up with so many problems. But again, you have the so-called land conflicts, especially in most densely populated areas. This is due to the pressure on the land. We have seen them. There's so many pressures connected with the land. But again, we have the issue of brain drained. People, they have a tendency of just looking for the green pastures, especially for developed countries. This is being caused by the persistence of high rate of unemployment and underemployment. We can just recall on the number in the last year, or in the few years, or the previous years, we used to have high flow of doctors to Botswana and Libya. Why? Because they were just looking for the green pastures. So it's one of the problems facing the African countries. But lastly, we can talk about other problems that results from the combination of what we have said above, which include high dependence ratio. You find that few people are working because you have so many people at the bottom, But again, you have low life expectancy. There's a high rate of infant mortality, which accelerate high birth rate. So, dear students, that was about the revision connected with the population problems facing the African countries. Because we have an assumption that if we're to Africa as a vast area, with low population density, as we have said, it's about 45 people per square kilometers. We could have expected that maybe due to that low population density, maybe we could have developed, but the vice versa is true. We are still suffering a lot. And this is cited from the concern that the human population is very important for the following issues or for the following factors, because we assume that the human populations will increase or stimulate agricultural activities, which at the end of the day will push up the development. Then you go to the so-called, or we can just recall about where we used to have the population which was basing or which was working on agricultural activities. But another assumption is the increased population growth could stimulate industrial development. Because you are assured with the market. But again, we could also assume that the increased population growth could provide the market. You can just make a reference to China. But again, that's the fourth assumption that there could be a large demand for important services. For instance, we are talking about transport and energy resources, which could have been an opportunity for development. But the vice versa is true. We have low population density, but still we are suffering a lot with population problems. But again, you could have been able to put the defensive mechanism for our countries or for African countries. And lastly, we could maybe talk about respectabilities and recognition of other nations or to the other nations. But in most cases, the African populations has resulted to be more liability rather than being an asset. And this is not only in Africans, but it is a cutting across issues, especially in all developing countries. That was about the revision pertaining to the problems facing African continent. So can we go to the next issue, which is all about having seen the problem facing the African in terms of populations, then we go to the specific area, that's about the environmental problems. We have specific environmental problems that are caused by the populations. That would be the area of revisions, starting with the idea that most of the populated areas are the urban areas. We all appreciate about that one. You can consider the situations in the urban cities of Tanzania, that is Dar es Salaam, Mwanza, Arusha, Mbeya, and Dodoma, the recent city. Those cities or those areas, they are suffering from all the forms of pollution. Where we see there is land pollutions, we have water pollutions, there is the air pollutions, but again there is noise pollutions. So those types of pollutions have a closer link with the population or with the high populated areas. Let's go to the next aspect that we have arranged. It's all about the so-called the environmental pollutions, problems caused by the high population growth. And remember, we are talking about the case of the urban area, urban areas. So for the case of Tanzania, we can talk about Mwanza, we talk about Dar es Salaam, we can talk about Arusha, we can talk about Mbeya, but again you can talk about the recent city that is Dodoma. So those are the potential cases for our reference, especially for the urban area. Though we don't say those are the only one, but because the question is just talking about the so-called what, the city centers or the urban area and the city areas. So basically, the problem caused by the pollution, which is related with the increasing number of people, include the following, because we have been limited about pollution. So we're talking about the pollution in terms of air. And when you talk about pollution in terms of air, I think we are all aware or familiar that most of the urban area, that's why we find that there's a concentration of what? Industries. And we know the industry that they're producing a lot of gases, the pollutant gases. So those gases, they also act as a pollutant, especially on the aspect of air. But again, it's in the urban area where you find that there is traffic congestion. And with traffic congestion, there is a connection with the so-called what? The pollution of pollutant gas, especially the carbon monoxide. But again, you can talk about the land. And when we talk about the land pollution, we are talking about all aspects connected with the wastage disposal, especially, or the wastage management in the urban area. If you go to the urban area, you find that there's a challenge, especially for the waste management. And then they are being dumped. So when they're dumped over there, you find that the situation won't be good. You can just recall about the situation in Dar es Salaam, especially before the banning of the so-called what? The plastic bags. The situation was very, very bad. That's about what? Land pollution. But again, you have the waste, the water pollution. And with water pollution, nothing else. That's why we're talking about addition of anything that will affect the water resources. So it can be in the oceans, it can be in the river or wherever. But that's also common along the urban area, because that's why you find there are so many activities that do produce so many things which at the end of the day they're being dumped in the water, on the water sources. But again, we have the so-called the noise. We have the noise pollution. It's common in the urban area. Why? Because that's why we find that there are so many industries, but also the urban area, that's why we find there are so-called what? So many recreation centers. You can find that we have the nightclubs, and nowadays we have the so-called what? We have so many churches, especially along the settlements. So there's the noise during the night. There are the connections, all that are associated with the so-called what? The pollution along the urban areas. But then we have those problems. Then what should be done? What should be done so that we can minimize the effect of pollution along the urban area, which is caused by the high population? We can come up with some measures. Maybe the first measures, it's about a proper city planning. There should be proper city planning so that we can be able to come up or to solve the issue of the so-called what? Waste management. I think you can recall the situation that's going on in Dodoma. I was told that in Dodoma it's not easier to establish any settlement if at all you have not been given the authorities, or the planning or the regional planning has done its own work. It's not. So if we manage to have the so-called what? Proper city planning, at the end of the day we can solve that problem which is caused by the what? By the pollutions. But again, we have the so-called what? We should encourage economic measures. And with economic measures, nothing else we're talking about, especially the pollutions. Because it's on the pollutions. We have said that we have the industries over there. So the industries which are producing more pollutant gases should be taxed high. If they're taxed high, it means that tax which is collected, it should be supporting other things over there. So that's how we can manage the so-called what? The pollutions. It's about the economic control. We just add, or we put high tax for those people who are producing high amount of what? Pollutant gases. But again, another measure that you can do is about massive education. So people should be educated. For instance, you can be educated about how to manage the traffic jam. Traffic jam management, with an assumption that if for those people that are well trained or they have education about the traffic jam management, it will be easier to minimize the effects of what? Air pollution. But again, another measure that can be done is about the provision of the rural, it's about providing or improving the rural areas. Here we are talking about the improving the rural areas. Improving the rural areas. Why are we talking about improving the rural areas? Because we just want to control the so-called what? Rural-urban migration. We need to control the number of people who are flowing toward the town or toward the cities. I take an example of Dar es Salaam. How many people are flowing daily in Dar es Salaam? And why are they flowing to Dar es Salaam? They are flowing to Dar es Salaam because they are looking for the employment. So what we should do over there, we should make sure that we improve the rural areas. You can take an example. I was reading one of the cases that are saying that there is so many projects going on in Mufindi. They're just dealing with the timber tree farming, but they're dealing with tree farming in terms of avocados, but also they're dealing with timber productions. So people have managed to stay there. They are no longer interested to come to the town. And that one is related with the so-called what? Rural-urban migration. So if you control the rural-urban migration, it means people will stay in the rural areas, they will be engaging in various activities, and they want to be coming to town. Then we'll be controlling the so-called what? Pollution in the urban area. But again, we can talk about the provision of financial facilities. We should provide the financial facilities to those people who are staying in the rural areas, because the people, if we want to control the rural-urban migration, those people, they need to be busy. But sometimes they do lack the so-called what? Financial support. They lack the financial support. So we should provide the finance, those people are living in the rural areas, either through, we say, the informal provision of financial support. I think currently I've heard so many people in the rural area that are talking about the so-called what? Vikoba. That's about the rural commercial, the village commercial banks, then the rural areas, because people they have an access to the so-called what? The finance. So if they have the finance, they want to be flowing to urban area. Therefore, we'll be controlling the so-called what? Pollutions. But again, we should improve the infrastructures. There should be the improvement of infrastructures in the rural areas and the urban areas, so that we can have smooth communications and the transportations from the rural areas to the urban areas. By doing that one, it will facilitate those people who are producing their products in the rural areas or their things in the rural areas to be able to be transported in Dar es Salaam, let's say an example. But if at all we don't have the improved infrastructures, those people, they will be facing so many problems. Then it becomes difficult for them to come to Dar es Salaam. So, dear students, you can just recall about the set objectives when we were starting about these revisions. We are targeting to establish the relationship or the interrelationship among the three variables, that is population, environment, and development. I think up to the moment you are aware, you can just link the three concepts. You can just recall on the triangle that we had. But again, we have been able to establish or to identify the problems facing the African countries, which are related directly with the population increase. But again, we are able to underline environmental pollutions caused by the high population growth, specifically in the populated areas, that is on the cities. We have cited examples from those cities. And lastly, we have been able to suggest the measures on how to control the population problem facing those areas. Before we wind up our sessions, I will just take you through the reflective questions, and later on, I will cite one of the questions which I will take you through so that I can give you some guidelines on how to solve that particular questions. So before starting that task, just listen to the following questions, or just recall about the following questions. We have 3 questions that we'll be calling on. The first question is about examine 6 effects of high population growth on the environment. You should examine the effects of high population growth on the environment. Then question number 2, it's about accounting for 6 measures in place to control urban populations. Then you should cite your examples from Tanzania city areas. And the last one, it's about suggesting 6 measures to be taken by Tanzanian government so as to manage the urban populations. Okay, dear students, let's go to the 4th intended objectives to be attained at that sessions, which is all about trying to come up with the sample questions according to what I've given you over there. Then I will take you through the revisions on what are the basic principles that you should observe when you are doing the essay type questions. So our sessions just proceed with how to solve essay type questions and what are the basic principles, because if you don't observe them, at the end of the day, we'll score low marks in your exam. So during our revisions, we should make sure that we abide to those principles. So the essay type questions should be solved based on the following. The essay type questions, basically, when you come across them, and that will be the center for Geography Paper 2, you should consider about the 3 parts. You should consider about the 3 parts, because they have some marks over there that will be distributed accordingly. The first part, it's all about the introduction part. Then the other thing that you should notice about the main body. And the third part is about the conclusion. It should be noted that those parts, the introductions, the main body, and the conclusions, at the end of the day, they will count some marks. Or those people will be marking your question, they will consider them. But again, the other things that you should consider when you are dealing with the essay type questions specifically for Geography Paper 2, it's about the issue of general questions. We have general questions, but again, we have specific questions. For the general questions, it means we are talking about the question that will be cutting across. It's not limiting anything. For instance, you can just recall about the first question, which was about examine 6 effects of high population growth on the environment. That question is just general. So you can set your examples starting from the local area to the global level. But again, assume that you come up with the questions which is requesting you to talk about the specific case. So if we are talking about the specific case, it means you should try your best level to draw examples from that particular case which you have been asking. But we have a tendency of not just specifying, is it a general question, is it a specific question? Take an example of the question number 2, which is about the account for 6 measures in place to control urban populations. Then set your examples from Tanzanian city. So again, you have been limited. Your scope is within Tanzanian context. So we should note about that particular thing, that we have the questions that will be general questions, but again, you have the questions which will be specific. So for the specific questions, just target yourself with the specific questions. Let's start to maybe to have a revision about the introduction part. The introduction basically should conceptualize all the relevant concepts that are within your questions. I think you have seen that question number 1, which is about examine 6 effects of high population growth on the environment. So over there, the concept to be conceptualized is about high population growth and related with the environment, and it should be supported by vivid examples. So if you manage to accommodate those requirements, at the end of the day, you score the 4 marks, which are required for that particular part of the introduction. But within the introductions, there is another thing that we should also note. The first one, we normally say it's all about correct introduction, or it can be relevant introduction. That's A. Then you go to B. The other thing to consider within the introduction, it's about relevant explanation. Relevant explanation. Though sometimes you'll be requested to provide correct explanation. Correct explanation. To depend on the nature of the questions. Then the other part which is very important is all about the supportive example. Supportive example. Or sometimes we say relevant example. And for the part of the relevant example over there, we have a tendency of just responding by saying, for instance, let's say a certain area. Then you end up just by mentioning one point or one thing. For the supportive example, I would like to advise you, you should observe the following format. Either you say, for instance, A and B. Again, you can talk about A, B, and C. It's very important to come up with that particular format. I'm trying to stress much about the introduction because sometimes you do miss the marks because we just come up with quite a different approach. So let's turn back to our question, which is all about examining the effects of high population growth on the environment by just recalling about what should be the issues to be considered over there. That question is requesting us to talk about the effects of high population growth. As I've said, it means over there you'll be requested to provide the correct meaning of the so-called high population growth. So over there, we'll not be talking about the relevant introduction. Rather, we'll be talking about the correct introduction because we're talking about high population growth, something that cannot vary, despite of the location and whatever. But again, when you come to the relevant explanation, it means you should provide the relevant explanations pertaining to the so-called high population growth. And lastly, as I said, you should support it with what? Example. The question is requesting about 6 effects of high population growth on the environment. So you can set the examples from the local, as I said, local area, or you can set examples from the global level because it's free questions or the general questions. But sometimes you can support it with vivid data, if at all you have the data to support that question. The next part, which is very important, it's all about the main body. The main body is very important also because that will be the main center of the questions, that's the main body. For the part of the main body, it's not quite different from what we are supposed to observe within the introductions. The main body, of course, should also be linked with the introductions. And over there, we just call the students, once you have done with your introduction, let's say pertaining to the high population growth on the environment, once you have done with the introduction, you are just advised to go to to introduce another separate sentence or paragraph so that you can introduce the introduction to the main body. So before the main body, there must be a connecting sentence in a new paragraph indicating the starting point of the new part of the question, that's the main body. Take an example. You can say the following are the 6 effects of population growth on the environment so that you can alert the marker to concentrate on that particular question that you are referring to. For instance, the main body for that particular question could be composed by the following points. The first one, you can talk about environmental degradations. We'll be having the sample to check how to explain that particular point. But again, you have environmental pollutions. And over there, I think you remember we have the aspect of the so-called what? Repetitions. When you say environmental pollution, it means you should compress all the forms of pollution rather than separating them by saying air, I don't know, water, and the noise pollution. That's one sentence, environmental pollutions. But then we have the loss of biodiversity. Again, we have the outbreak of disease, and we have deforestation. But again, it can facilitate massive natural hazard effects. Those are the points that we may use for that particular question which you have been asking. We have another task that how should we explain each point? It's very important because you can do an intensive revision, you can study so many things, but remember at the end of the day, you have an examination. And that particular examinations, of course, it is observing the scientific principles in terms of marking. So what should be done within the point? I'm saying that you should observe the following format. As I said, it's not quite different from the introductions. It's all about trying to stress about the basic principle that you should observe when you are writing your paper. Because we are doing the revision, but that revision, regardless of whatever you can do, if at all we don't abide to the format of the essay type questions, at the end of the day, you won't score good marks. So you should try your best to come up with the observation of those principles. So the main part, as I say, the main body, that's the center of the questions. So you should treat each point as an independent point, though at the end of the day they are connected. But again, within the main board, it's not quite different as we have seen on the introduction. You should observe the following format when you come to the main board. The first one, as we said, it's about the correct point, or it can be the relevant point. That's something that you should observe. The correct point or the relevant point. But again, apart from that one, there is the correct explanation on that particular point which we are talking about. Or it can be relevant explanations. Correct explanations or correct descriptions about the point. Some of the points will be requesting you to come up with the same explanations. But sometimes you may not be having the same explanations, but you have the explanation which are related to what you have raised at the point. And lastly, as we said, on the part of the introductions, you should come up with the correct examples, or we say relevant examples. So this is the principle that you should observe over there. If you don't observe them, it means at the end of the day you won't score the required marks. You are facing the exam ahead of you, so you need to be aware about that particular format. For instance, the correct point or the relevant point, as I said, it's all about ending up with, so if it be the correct point, we also end up with correct explanations. If the point's about relevant point, we end up with relevant explanations. The same applied for the example. The correct point will go with the correct examples. But again, the relevant point will go with relevant example. The issue of example, as we said over there, it should also observe the format that you should come up with the vivid example or supportive data of that particular question. So if you adapt that particular template, at the end of the day, you'll be in a good position to respond on various essay type questions. So let's go to the practical aspect for that particular thing that we've been talking about. Take an example of the first point, which was about environmental degradation. Environmental degradation. So with environmental degradations, there's nothing else. Rather, it's about the correct points. For the correct point, what are you supposed to do over there? Environmental degradations, for instance, you can say environmental degradations as an effect on the high population growth on the environment. You can also state it in the form of the topic close sentences in relation to the question that you have been asking. As we said, environmental degradations as one of the effects of high population growth. Avoid those habits of just writing a single point, just you say environment. Or sometimes people, they are saying capital. Or sometimes people, they are saying marketing. Remember, this is one word. So we are just encouraging you to come up with the so-called word, the closed sentence, or the topic closed sentence, which will be guiding the marker that are moving in that directions. But that direction should also be within the question that you have been asking. For instance, we just proceed with environmental degradation. It accelerates environmental degradations. That's the correct point. Don't say environmental degradation as we said over there. Rather, the topic closed sentence requests you to talk about it accelerate. It accelerates environmental environmental degradation. So this is one of the effects of high population growth. Somebody is aware that, oh, over there is the acceleration of environmental degradations. But if write environmental degradations, this is not the topic closed sentence. So if you say to accelerate environmental degradations, for instance, we say high population growth creates pressure on the environment, which degrades the capacity of the environment to support the available populations. Those are the, we say those are the relevant explanations pertaining to that particular point. Then you go for the citation of the example, you say, for example, high populations do accelerate the agents of erosions on the land, such as water, air, and the wind, which also facilitate soil erosions. And later on, the land becomes unproductive. A good example, so you are now citing an example, as we said, so that you can accommodate the correct point. A good example can be drawn from some parts where the land has become degraded or has been degraded and is no longer productive, as it is the case in Singida, Tabora, and Morogoro, or in some parts of Singida, Tabora, and Morogoro. So over there, it means we have accommodated the first approach of citing example. You're talking about A, B, and C. We have said Singida, Tabora, and Morogoro. But if you come up by saying, they say, for instance, Singida, we just encourage you to extend your example so that you can be able to accommodate the full marks. So the essay type questions should have a conclusion. Once we have done with the main board, remember we said we have 6 points, so I've tried my best level just to clarify about 1 point, which is about acceleration of environmental degradations. The remaining point, make sure that you have the intensive revisions, you follow the same format so that you can check if at all you can score the highest marks. Again, we just go to the third part of the essay type of questions, which we have said it's about the conclusion. The conclusion is very important to be considered in essay type of questions. That's about the conclusion. Since the conclusions will be the part and the parcel of the questions, you need to observe the following principles. So the last part of the essay type question should be the conclusion. There is a problem with that particular part, and sometimes we do miss the marks on the part of the conclusion. The marks, it's because we just draw the conclusion, which is not related with what we have said, or we just use one sentence. The above are the effects of environmental degradation, but we're encouraging you to be careful on that particular part because it will be considered during the marking process. So you are advised to draw the conclusions which is relevant to the questions. By comprehending it, all the tackled points, and draw your judgment or anticipating what will happen if something won't be done. With your question, we are saying examine 6 effects of high population growth on the environment. So the conclusion over there can be the summation of all the points, but then at the end of the day, you should provide the judgments. Then what should be done so that you can maybe retardate that particular problems. For our questions, a relevant conclusion can be concluded based on what should be done, as we have said, by stressing, by suggesting at least a few measures that are in place or which should be taken so as to address it. So I also want to caution you students, avoid the habit of just saying the above are the effects of high population growth on the environment. If you come up with the marker who is following the phrase over there, we ask you what? So what? Yes, you have said the above are the effects of high population growth on the environment. Then so what? Over there, we expect you to come up with what should be done, because you are learning so that you can address also of the problems. But also, avoid re-mentioning the same points as the part of the conclusions. You find some students, they are now starting to re-mention some points, and then they consider this it as the what? The part and the parcel of the what? Of the conclusions. Over there, you won't score any marks connected with the conclusions. For the marking science, all parts of the questions are considered. Thus, avoid rushing in any point, since each point is marked despite of the marks awarded. So, dear student, I think you are now aware about the parts that should be observed when you are responding on essay type of questions. As I said, observe all the requirements within the introductions, all the principles, but about the main board, the same apply to the conclusions. That was all about the first question, which was about assessing the effects of high population growth on the environment. Then question number 2, the same applied. It's all about the accounting for 6 measures in place to control urban population. Set examples from Tanzania. So the second question, it is quite different from the first question, because the first question was too general. But for that particular case, that's why we come up with what we said over there, that we're talking about the specific question. Specific question. Then with the specific question, it means we're talking about the case. So if it is the case, you should try your best to be able to draw examples from that particular case which you have been asking. So the first question was too general, but the second question just requesting you to cite examples from Tanzanian cities. So over there, you need to be aware about how many cities do we have in Tanzania. Avoid mentioning an examples which not be talking about the cities which are taken from Tanzania. So as it is, we have said, observe the parts of the question, that introduction, main body, and the conclusion, since it's an essay type question, as we said from the beginning. Say relevant introduction which related with urban populations with reference to Tanzania cities, since this is the specific question, as I said. Connect the introduction with the main body. You can use the following sentence I said. The following are the 6 measures in place to control the urban population, so that you can alert the marker to be aware with the flow of your essay. So the following are the 6 measures in place to control urban population in Tanzania. I assume that you are now aware with the introduction, and you can observe all the requirements, but then we go to the main board, which will be all about the points. You can talk about proper urban planning. I think you remember we said those issues, ensuring affordable and accessible transport and communication infrastructures. It's one of the measures in place. This has been done, as we have said. We have regular maintenance of transport and communication infrastructures. We have them in Dar es Salaam. Then you can talk about improving the life standards of the rural urban so that can control rural urban migration. Remember that question. Establishing new planned centers or settlements. This also is very important to come up with the so-called what, or to call the conclusions. For question number 3, this is also an essay type question. We should consider the 3 parts as we said, but this question is similar to question number 2, though the difference is that the question 2 required the measures in place being implemented, or while the question number 3 is just requiring us to suggest some measures. We assume that they are not yet implemented, but you can just suggest them because you have seen those things over there. So it's quite different from the second topic, which was talking about the specific measure, but over there we're talking about suggesting the general measures. So dear students, that was all about the revision of today's sessions. Thank you, dear students, for your time. We have managed to have an intensive revision on the subtopic of the first topic in the Geography Paper 2, that's about population growth and socio-economic planning. I would like to give you further reference, which you will use maybe to revise that particular subtopic, because it seems to be complicated, but if you have the following reference, they can assist you just to recall and to have an intensive revisions on what we have been discussing, starting from the first sessions up to the second sessions. We have that book of Biebare, that Biamgisha, you can just recall. It's about focus on the world geography. But again, you have that book of this Camille, which is about geography to alive. It's about human economic geography. But again, I just encourage you to go to the book of Morgan, which is all about human economic geography. We have Tanzania Population Policy of 1992, but again, that may not be important. You can just go to the recent one, which is about the revised population policy of 2006. But again, if you can access the book of Pritchard, just go through it. It's about, practical geography for Africans. There is so many, he has tried to set examples connected with the population issues. And the last one, don't forget that book which you normally prefer, that's about integrated geography. It's very important also. It can give you an overview connected with that particular subtopic. But again, those references, they can be ordered and physically home derived. If at all you can use the following number, you can access them. So thank you, dear students. See you and stay blessed. Thank you.